Apologies for my lateness as well. David and I turned up really late, and I was meant to be on the panel for clinical parapsychology as well, covering for Stan Krippner, who couldn't be here, and he sends his apologies as well. Were I here, I would have actually discussed the topic of psi in psychotherapy with you, which we worked on recently, republishing the work of Alex Tannis from 1985. So that kind of stuff is here. If you want to know more about that, ask me afterwards. I'll be delighted to tell you what we've been doing with that kind of research and archival work as well. So a lot of my background research, certainly my doctorate as well, was looking at after-death communication. So I want to give you a rundown of the history and what this phenomenon is like, some of the initial studies that have been done, and then lead through to what we've been doing with the scientific and medical network that has led to the study that we're presenting today. So much like David, going back in time, we're going back to the roots of psychical research. And medical research now is paying more and more attention with death, dying, and bereavement to sense of presence experiences and taking on board what people have to say about them. But in many cases, they're doing it as though it's something quite new. And that's quite frustrating because when you go back to Phantasms of the Living, two-volume piece that was published by the Society for Psychical Research, they kept revisiting that and extracting cases to then publish new studies within the proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research. And they're pretty much talking about sense of presence experiences and what we call the after-death communication. So all kinds of phenomena suggestive of communication with the dead, either close to death and more in some instances, but afterwards, after the person's died, what kind of phenomena is happening as well. So example here, Edmund Gurney, who's actually on the right, and Frederick Myers is on the left. I put them that way around, otherwise it looked like they'd had an argument being back to back. Edmund Gurney was working on this paper, fortunately passed away during the time of it, so Frederick Myers finished it off in volume 5 of the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, entitled On Apparitions Occurring Soon After Death. So these were extracted from Phantasms of the Living, 231 cases, and they were revisited. In 104 cases, it was not known whether the recipient's cases preceded or followed the experience of death. And in 40 cases, the experience of apparitions occurred within a 24-hour period as well, which we call the crisis period. 24 hours up until the point of someone dying. People might have experiences around the deathbed. People like Sir William Barrett have discussed this, Camille Flammarion in the 3-volume trilogy, Death and Its Mystery. And the reason they don't know all the information about these cases is a lot of them were sent in by letter correspondence and they were taken as they were, that there was, in some instances, no way of actually following up what actually happened and more of the details about them. But when they did this analysis, there's this basic line drawing that they did in their paper showing that within that week period, someone perhaps on their deathbed, or more uniquely in some cases when you don't know that person is going to die, some unusual phenomena actually happening surrounding that person. At the point of death, so on the deathbed, people experiencing maybe an instant breeze going past them, strange smells, or perhaps even seeing an apparition as well. For some nursing homes and care homes or end-of-life care units, they still keep this really nice tradition in many cases of leaving the window or the doors open, so if anything is leaving the body, it's got a way of actually leaving the room and going back out into the world. And then over a year-long period, this kind of phenomena, sensing the presence of someone in the room who isn't physically there, smells, touch, taste, all kinds of things like that, seem to disappear over a year-long period, or more so they start to be incorporated into people's daily lives, because we have some people that decades afterwards are reporting being out and about, running an errand, and then all of a sudden something seems to happen. Following that, volume 10 of the SPR, we have the classic report on the senses of hallucinations, which is still widely cited. This went out to 17,000 people by postal correspondence, so extremely impressive for the time. And one of the main questions asked was, have you ever had a vivid impression of seeing or being touched or of hearing voices which impression, so far as you could discover, was not due to any external cause? And from this, when we actually look again and we try and home in on the after-death communications, we have about 10% of people within the feedback actually discussing experiences that seem to be pretty much at ADC phenomena. So even then, quite popular as well within the survey. So when was it actually gaining recognition? We've got that, volume 6 of the SPR proceedings as well. Frederick Myers and Frank Podmore were discussing more about Phantasms of the Dead and the defense for them, following on from the paper I just discussed in volume 5. But when did it get recognition? Well, William Derry Rees was a GP who'd worked in Canada for a while, but he was based in North Wales. And he was actually quite a widely published GP. Not many GPs are actually active in their research, but he was talking about rural tractor incidences and the negative after effects of bereavement, such as insomnia and not wanting to socialize and oversensitiveness to noise. He was trying to list all these negative outcomes. And he discovered that for some people, they said, oh, after the person passed away, I still felt them around me in some way. He found this fascinating and decided to go back to his entire set of participants and re-interview them to find out what was going on. This was incorporated into a medical doctorate he was doing at King's College London, more so he could gain respect and acceptance within the research community. He didn't need the medical doctorate. He already held doctorate status, but the MD was getting his foot in the door with researchers. So he had 293 widows and widowers, all interviewed. Roughly half reported these experiences, most common within the first 10 years. Gender, social group, age, levels of depression. This didn't really seem to have an impact on the occurrence of hallucinations or not. And so one of the questions that was asked within this was, right, was this helpful to you, harmful or unsure? Vast majority of people said it was extremely helpful to bereavement and recovery to have these kinds of experiences, sensing the presence, dreaming about the person, seeing apparitions. Some people initially said harmful just because it was spontaneous, it frightened them, and in some very rare cases, if the person has died in an accident, they might be visualized still perhaps bleeding and injured or looking unwell, but that was very rare for that to happen. And some people just weren't sure. The next person to follow up was Julian Burton. He was an actor in the USA, most famous for a film called The Bucket of Blood. And he decided after an experience he'd had, losing his mother, that he'd turn back to higher education and find out more about this. He said that, I'm afraid a bias still exists. I'll skip the quote because I'm going to run out of time, but a bias still exists where people are shunned and trained to ignore these as a side effect of bereavement, effectively. So he had 206 participants in his study. There's a summary article in Fate magazine, and this is his account that made him interested, made him go back to do a PhD. I'd always felt a strong bond between us, but by September, most of us in the family had returned to our routines reconciled to her death. One evening that September, my wife and I were entertaining relatives. I was in the kitchen cutting a pineapple when I heard what I thought were my wife's footsteps behind me to the right. I turned to ask the whereabouts of a bowl, but realized she had crossed to the left outside of my field of vision. I turned to that direction to repeat my question and saw my mother standing there. Burton describes his mother's apparition looking 10 years younger than she was when she died and in good health, and she was wearing a detailed pale blue gown they'd never seen before. Ma, I exclaimed. She smiled and then dissolved. She didn't disappear, she dissolved. I let out a great sigh of relief and felt a heavy weight had been lifted from me, a weight I've not even felt until then. So this is quite common for people to say a big weight has been actually left from them. They have this final goodbye. He rang his sister the next morning. She was absolutely distraught, not because of what he was claiming so much. She was quite jealous that he'd had an experience and she hadn't. She felt to be a lot closer to the mother until he described the pale blue gown. And she said, well, that's my message. That makes sense to me. She stopped crying. She said 3 or 4 weeks before Mother died, we'd gone shopping together, and she tried on this pale blue gown to the exact detail you're describing, and then she looked at the price tag, and it said $500, and she wasn't willing to part with that amount of money for the gown, but she ummed and ahed, should I treat myself or not? That makes sense to me. So we'd refer to this as veridical information. The apparition contained some additional features that didn't make sense to Julian Burton, but did to his sister. So I followed this forward in my own research. There's been about 15 doctoral studies, from medical doctorates to psychology doctorates to PhDs, looking at these experiences. I wanted to look at how people had said that these experiences give them hope. So we're looking more so at the clinical parapsychology aspect. How do these help people, bereavement and recovery? That shouldn't say experimental, but more so experiential group. I've still not changed that, whoops. But this group over here on the left, that is the group that had the experiences. Their levels of hope is in blue beforehand. And for the group that never reported these experiences, 50 people and 50 people. After having an experience, for that side on the left, and after just suffering the loss, we do have a drop in hope, but for the people that had the experience on the left, it wasn't a statistically significant drop in hope. We believe that the experiences facilitated the gap of loss, and it gave them something to move forward on. They were actually latching onto this experience. For the other side, it was a statistically significant drop, and people had to turn to what we call grief work and looking for other tactics to help with. Please stop. And that's perfect, more or less, because I just repeated the fact that these were helpful for our people involved. We found the same thing as Burton did, and pretty much the same in terms of how often they occur. Over to Chris.
Thank you. Yes.